It's time. It's just time. It's time for these families. I'm just so grateful that we got to this day.
Hello, and welcome to Psycho Killer. I'm Simon Ford.
And I'm Jack Morrell. He's an experienced journalist.
And he's an experienced detective.
And I'm Pip Watts, a broadcaster and journalist fascinated by the minds of murderers. Together, we take a fresh look at notorious homicides and the psycho killers who commit them.
Welcome to a series of 3 podcasts looking at 3 cases. The first you'll know about, and we're focusing on one particular aspect of it.
The second case is one that I had the privilege of working on.
And the third is a recent case from Australia. I'm particularly interested in this one.
All the victims were female. All the crimes went unsolved for some time. The police were baffled. They'd exhausted all lines of inquiry.
And the press reminded them of that fact at every possible opportunity.
Whole communities were affected. People were anxious. They became suspicious of their neighbours, and no wonder. The killer in each case was a stranger, and he was still out there.
All 3 killers were identified from DNA they left at the crime scenes. The problem was, the killers hadn't been arrested before, or at least if they had, their DNA hadn't been taken.
What links these cases was that a blood relative of each killer inadvertently identified the murderer in their midst.
Like they say, you can choose your friends, but not your family. Let's head to the dark side for case number 1.
So, Jack, let's look at the different ways DNA from a family member, what you call familial DNA, can help to catch a killer. First, you have to have a sample from the crime scene, and you check it against the police database, but there's no match, correct?
Correct. So the investigation has a DNA profile that they believe is from the offender, but who's not provided their DNA to the police before. Bear in mind that in the UK, the national database has around 6 million individual profiles, so about 10% of the population. The simplest and traditional method is to invite people to voluntarily provide their DNA to assist the investigation. Most murders, let's remember, are committed by someone who is either known to the victim or has links to the area.
Of course, yes, Colin Pitchfork was the first killer caught after DNA samples were taken from local people to eliminate them from the inquiry. But this takes it to a different level. This is asking someone who doesn't fit the profile of the killer to give their DNA just in case the killer's related to them.
Right. But remember, families tend to stay in an area. 1 or 2 family members may move away, but in the main, families stay put.
There's a lot of ethics at play in all this too. The law on it differs between countries. And this is on top of the rules regarding the retention of someone's DNA, particularly where they weren't convicted of a crime.
Exactly. And the bottom line is that when people provide their DNA, they are told what happens to it.
So for familial DNA to identify a suspect, we need to find a parent, sibling or child of the killer. The parent may be deceased, of course, and the killer may be an only child and hadn't produced a child of their own. That's a lot of variables.
Janelle Cruz was 18 years old in 1986. She was found by an estate agent who'd arrived one morning to conduct a viewing of her mother's home in Orange County, California. Janelle had been raped and bludgeoned to death.
Janelle might have been alone on the night she died, but in death, she joined a long list of people who were victims of the same man. He was so prolific, committing at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and 120 burglaries across California. All this in a 12-year period between 1974 and 1986.
So prolific, in fact, that his crime sprees would spawn a different nickname in the press before it became evident that they were committed by the same person. In the San Joaquin Valley, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker.
When he moved into the Sacramento area, he became known as the East Area Rapist.
In Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties, he was known as the Night Stalker, and then the original Night Stalker. In 2001, after DNA testing indicated that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person, California's DNA database was established. It was then that crime writer Michelle-Mcnamara coined a new name for him, the Golden State Killer.
Mr. DeAngelo broke in and woke up my sister and tied her up. We were both threatened and I was raped multiple times. I was 15 years old, but we were lucky he didn't kill us.
Janelle Cruz had been dead for a decade when it was discovered that the DNA sample from her body matched DNA from other murders and 2 rape cases from the late 1970s. Janelle Cruz was an 18-year-old restaurant worker. Her parents were away on holiday on the night of the 3rd of May. A friend had visited, and during the evening they heard strange noises outside and in the garage. They didn't think anything more of it, and her friend left around midnight. The next morning, an estate agent came to show the house and discovered Janelle in her bedroom. She'd been raped and bludgeoned to death, her teeth shattered, and her face was blooded beyond recognition. There were tennis shoe footprints in the soil outside the house, and a metal wrench was missing from the backyard.
Detectives initially homed in on the last people to see Janelle alive and her former boyfriends, but the case went cold. Although police assembled a rape kit, DNA testing of crime scene evidence was in its infancy, and the kit was placed in storage for many years. Meanwhile, the Cruz family tried to get on with their lives, but the thought of Janelle's killer walking free terrorized them.
I haven't been home alone in my house for 32 years,
says Michelle Cruz White, Janelle's younger sister.
I've been living in fear, and my mum too.
They didn't know it in 1986, but Janelle was the last known victim of the Golden State Killer, ending the decade-long crime spree of one of the most sadistic serial killers and rapists in American history. It wasn't until the advent of DNA testing that law enforcement realized they were dealing with a single predator. And even then, it took another 2 decades to find him. Investigators had DNA samples linking the crimes, but they weren't a match for anyone on the FBI's national database.
In true Hollywood style, though, there was some nifty police footwork that had the lawyers dusting off the statute books. According to the LA Times, when Joseph DeAngelo was arrested, prosecutors would only reveal that they'd used family tree searches to find relatives of the killer, and from there identified DeAngelo. But after the conviction, a detective confirmed that the investigation team had uploaded semen from the rape kit to develop a fresh DNA profile that was then uploaded to GEDmatch, an open-source platform that folks use to trace their heritage. There was a bit of sleight of hand by the police.
It also came out that the genetic material from the rape kit was first sent to Family Tree DNA, which created a DNA profile and allowed law enforcement to set up a fake account to search for matching customers. When that produced only distant leads, a civilian geneticist working with investigators uploaded the forensic profile to MyHeritage. It was the MyHeritage search that identified the close relative who helped crack the case.
The case sparked privacy fears in the US, largely because investigators used a consumer service whose users unwittingly became genetic informants. If even your distant relatives use these services, then their DNA could get you jailed, provided, of course, that you have committed a crime. Curtis Rogers co-founder of GEDmatch, told New Scientist that he spent 2 weeks not sleeping as he tried to figure out the ethics of the situation.
Do we ensure that the privacy of all our users is protected? Or do we go after murderers who make Jack the Ripper sound like a choir boy? He asked.
The break came after Paul Holes, a retired investigator with the Contra Costa District Attorney's Office and long-time investigator on the case, searched GEDmatch. According to the Sacramento Bee, the site has a database of 800,000 DNA profiles. Sacramento District Attorney Chief Deputy Steve Grippy confirmed that a family member of DeAngelo's had used the service, and they were able to isolate him as a suspect and collect discarded DNA on 2 occasions.
Okay, one for you, Jack. What does discarded DNA mean?
Well, probably they did a surveillance on him and maybe retrieved a cigarette that he dropped in the street. They were basically turning the information from the GEDmatch data into evidence. "We were looking for a needle in a haystack and we found it," said District Attorney Schubert in 2000. So, Pip, what did they know about this man when they checked him out?
DeAngelo was a former police officer with the Auburn Police Department. He was fired in 1979 after he was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a hardware store. He was married with a daughter. He had worked as a truck mechanic for a grocery store chain for 27 years. Sheriff Scott Jones told the Sacramento Bee that DeAngelo was very surprised when he was arrested.
I bet.
Following his arrest, officers from all over the state flocked to the quiet street in Citrus Heights to see what the search of his house would reveal.
Interesting. So, going back to GEDmatch, the DNA database, what is it set up to do?
GEDmatch is a primarily free genealogy site that lets users upload their own DNA to find relatives. It was founded in 2010. The powerful GEDmatch Genesis tool matches profiles from its 1.3 million users and brings DNA profiles together from other sites such as Ancestry DNA.
And going back to my police background and the transparency required to obtain DNA for police purposes, what is the user told about what happens to the data?
GEDmatch is currently owned by Verigen, a forensic genomics company. Verigen makes money in part by allowing law enforcement to use their genealogy database to solve crimes. This might mean that your DNA could help identify a victim of a crime or the criminal.
Of course, there'll also be DNA taken from the remains of unidentified bodies.
We'll come on to that in the Australian case in episode 3.
The Golden State Killer is a renowned case for a number of reasons. Many programs and articles have been written about it. Whatever the ethics and legality of using DNA gathered for commercial purposes, the conviction of DeAngelo is an incredible result.
So, who was Joseph James DeAngelo Jr.? He was born in 1945 in the small town of Bath in New York State, between New York City and Niagara Falls. His parents were Kathleen Louise DeGroat and Joseph James DeAngelo. It's right at the end of World War II, and DeAngelo Sr. was a sergeant in the United States Army. They had 3 more children, 2 girls and a boy. They were stationed in West Germany for a time, and it's reported that when DeAngelo was a young child, he witnessed his 7-year-old sister's rape by 2 airmen in a warehouse. There's also some suggestion that DeAngelo Jr. suffered abuse at the hands of his father.
When the family returned to the USA, they moved to California, where DeAngelo attended high school. He left in 1964 when he attained a General Certificate of Education, along with a less impressive reputation for committing burglary and torturing animals. Despite this behaviour, at 19 years old, DeAngelo joined the United States Navy, and served for 22 months during the Vietnam War under the rather apt role of damage control. After military service, he must have taken a liking to wearing a uniform, now setting his sights on a police career. He graduated with an associate degree in police science with honours, followed by a degree in criminal justice. DeAngelo did some more courses and then police training at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia. The police department in Roseville, California, accepted him with open arms.
Between 1973 and 1976, DeAngelo was putting his teenage burgling experiences to good use as a burglary unit police officer in Exeter, a town of some 5,000 people near Visalia, a few hours' drive south of Sacramento, having relocated from Citrus Heights. He then served in Auburn from August 1976 to July 1979, when he was arrested for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. He was sentenced to 6 months probation and fired that October. During the process of being fired, DeAngelo threatened to kill the chief of police and allegedly stalked the chief's house.
So, regardless of the suitability or not of DeAngelo to have ever been a police officer, he left it under a cloud. Things were different then, but it's fair to say that his colleagues discovered that he was dishonest, violent, and an irrational individual who was behaving rather oddly. What do we know then about his relationships?
Well, in 1970, DeAngelo was engaged to a former classmate at college, but Bonnie Colwell had second thoughts about their future together. She ended the relationship after he threatened her with a gun in order to force her to marry him. By 1973, he charmed another woman into marriage. He married Sharon Huddle, and in 1980, they purchased the house in Citrus Heights, where he was arrested decades later. They had 3 daughters together, and the marriage survived until 1991, when they separated. In July 2018, several months after DeAngelo's arrest, Huddle filed for a divorce, which was finalised the following year. DeAngelo's employment history during the 1980s is unknown, but from 1990 until his retirement in 2017, he worked as a truck mechanic in the town of Roseville. At the time of his arrest, he was living with one of his daughters and granddaughter. He hadn't lost his temper, though. His final act as a free man was threatening to kill a neighbour whose dog barked too much.
I don't think there's much doubt about DeAngelo scoring the magic number on the psychopath test. He is cunning and manipulative. He lacks remorse or guilt. He exhibits reduced emotional responses, callousness, and a lack of empathy. He has poor behavioural controls. He displayed early behavioural problems, and he is impulsive. He's ticking all the boxes. Oh, and if you'd like to take a psychopath test, head on over to psycho-killer.co, where you'll find a link to one like forensic scientists use.
On June the 29th, 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and multiple counts of rape and kidnapping. As part of a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty, he also admitted to numerous crimes with which he had not been formally charged. On August the 21st, 2020, DeAngelo was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And what did he have to say for himself?
The former police officer known as the Golden State Killer, one of the world's most infamous killers and rapists, rose from his wheelchair in court Friday to apologize to his victims.
And I'm really sorry.
Joseph DeAngelo sentenced to life without parole after confessing to 13 murders and more than 50 rapes in the 70s and 80s in California.
We were both threatened, and I was raped multiple times. I was 15 years old, but we were lucky he didn't kill us.
He stole my youth, my innocence. Who could I have grown up to be? I guess I'll never know.
I honestly believe that this person, not even a person, this beast, deserved the ultimate punishment of death. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer told ABC News. But we met with our victims, we knew the age of the case, we knew how long it took to solve, and we knew that this was the right thing to do. Spitzer continued, quote, "For the victims whose voices have been stolen and the family members who sadly ran out of time and couldn't make it here today, I want you to know that there are 13 angels watching us." Unquote.
District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert added, "My greatest hope for all these victims and their families perhaps is best put in their own words, as we heard this week. The greatest revenge is to live your lives. Paint your children's and your grandchildren's rooms again with hearts and rainbows. Water ski again. Know that the monster of your childhood or your younger years is gone forever and will die alone in the dark."
Thanks for listening. In the next instalment, we'll tell you about a case that I worked on as a detective, where Familial DNA helped snare a child sex killer who'd left his victim's naked body sprawled in a field. He thought he'd gotten away with it, and he might have done too, if it hadn't been for advances in forensic science.
For now, it's goodbye from me, from Pip, and from Jack. We'll see you again soon on the dark side for another psycho killer, shocking true crime story.